sure that the training you're giving is not something that's not applicable or something that's not relatable to the audience you have, to make it more effective. So with that in mind, at one of our recent fire safety refreshers, I was tasked with going over the 10 standard fire orders and the 18 watch out situations. And as I thought about this and then thought about the audience, the majority of the audience had very little fire suppression experience. They did, however, have a lot of prescribed fire experience. So in looking at the 10 standard fire orders, they are pretty universal across both the prescribed fire and the suppression side of things. However, if you look at the 18 watch out situations, a number of them aren't really applicable in the prescribed fire world. So what I thought I'd do for the discussion was kind of do a brainstorming session with the class to try and come up with some prescribed fire watch out situations based on their experience. And what we came up with 11, a bullet list of 11. Most came out of the discussion. A couple I put in there based on my experience as well. And let's get into them. So number one, this was actually something that came up later in the discussion, but I bumped it up to the top of the list because I feel like it's a really important item, and that is inefficient use of time or inefficient time management on burn days. There's all sorts of things that you can cite for this, for doing prep work ahead of the burn, to what time folks are showing up, to how long your briefings are. How are you using your time, and is it being used in the most efficient way possible? The biggest ramification to me in that inefficient time management is pushing your burn windows, or misaligning your burn windows. If you are taking too much time getting prepped for the burn, doing the briefings, getting fire on the ground, what is that doing to your burn window? It can be two things. It can push a critical part of your firing operation into a time of day when you don't want it to be there. You could be hitting that early afternoon, max temperature, low RH, drying fuels conditions at a point in your burn progression, your firing progression, that you don't want to be if you don't have to be. Another way of looking at that is you may run out of daylight to get your burn project completed because you spent too much time on the front end doing things that could have been done earlier or differently. So that time management thing is very important. Time is the most valuable commodity we have on these burn projects. Number 2 on the list, inadequate contingency planning and or underdeveloped contingency planning on the briefing, in the briefings. The planning part of it's fairly self-explanatory. You should have worked through those contingencies and made those connections prior to burn days. So that should be something that's done obviously ahead of time. Where I see us falling down sometimes during the briefings is not adequately covering those contingencies during the briefings. You don't want to get halfway into a burn, have something go sideways, and not have folks on the burn understand what the plan is, what the contingencies are. I've noticed there's some things we cover very well in briefings, and there's some things that we don't spend as much time on. The contingency planning, the contingency part of it is something I feel like we don't spend as much time on as we should. Number 3, inaccurate or incomplete information products for the burn. And this goes to your mapping products, your contact list, your communications frequency, radio frequencies, that sort of thing. A lot of times, our burn plans get rolled over year to year. Sometimes things get outdated, and if you don't catch those in the planning process, then you're handing someone on burn day an information product of one kind or another that may not be current or accurate. That's a watch out situation. Number 4 on the list is somewhat related to number 3, which I characterized as using or having a reliance on technology, which then creates operational or safety failure points. Technology, in this case, mostly what I'm talking about is smartphones, and to a lesser degree GPS units individually, but mostly smartphones and all the apps and functions that are on a modern smartphone these days. What I say frequently is that technology will overwhelm some percentage of the user. And what I mean by that is don't assume as a planner or a burn boss that you can transmit maps and other products via a smartphone and have folks rely on that, because the technology usage, the technology is a useful item only if you know how to use it. And if someone has a smartphone and can't make the apps work or can't understand how to make things work, it's useless for an information system. Better to have a paper map sometimes than just relying on a cell phone itself. Number 5, if you have a high percentage of your burn crew members that are green or inexperienced, we use AmeriCorps volunteers quite a bit, have in the past number of years. What AmeriCorps brings to the table is usually 6 or 8 folks that have had fire training but have no practical fire line experience or very little. The problem with that, or the watch out with that, is fairly self-evident, but kind of the corollary tailing off of having that many inexperienced folks is having to compensate for that in your leadership functions, and having to manage having that many folks that are inexperienced on your burn. You have to plan not just what to do with them, but how to manage them and make sure that they have adequate span of control and leadership. Number 6, limited specialized training or experience on the crew. Where this came up in the discussion specifically was fire suppression experience. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, a lot of the folks in the fire refresher had very little suppression experience. And obviously, if you have to go from that prescribed fire operation to a full-on suppression mode during the burn because of an escape or whatever, having folks that have done that before is definitely an advantage. If you don't have that on your burn crew, that should be a watch-out situation. Number 7, burning at your minimum staffing requirements for the burns. Now, most all of the burn plans, at least that I'm familiar with, have to have a minimum staffing component in the plan. And if you are burning at that minimum, by definition, that should be a watch-out situation. It's not to say you can't do it or you shouldn't be doing it, but if you're at that minimum level, that effectively means one less person and you're not burning that day. So that should tell you something. That should be a watch-out. The consideration should be conditions driven and experience driven for that consideration. What are the fuel conditions? How many times has this unit been burned? What's surrounding the unit? These should be factors in looking at that staffing requirement. Also, the experience level of that group that's making up your staffing. Are they a large percentage of green folks. So you weigh this conditions, your fuel and environmental conditions, your experience and your crew level, both should be going into that staffing requirement. There are many times when you may, because of one condition or the other, want to overstaff a project. You don't want to get caught saying, well, we meet the minimum staffing requirements. My better judgment is that we probably shouldn't be doing this, but we're going to go ahead. Number 8, your assignments or your chain of command shift during the burn. And this could be because you're trying to meet some training needs, training requirements. You're rotating people through leadership positions during the burn. Sometimes because of scheduling, folks may have to leave before the end of the burn period. They're no longer plugged into the burn organization you started with. May not be leadership positions. It may just be someone that's in a critical position within the fire organization, and they are no longer there. They've been unplugged, and you're plugging someone else different into that position. That should be a watch out situation for everyone. Number 9, your complexity or the size or scale of your burn project starts to exceed your normal communications equipment or your normal communications systems. We had this occur on a burn last year where the size of it was such that essentially one side of the burn could no longer talk to the other side of the burn because things got so spread out. What works on a 50-acre burn project or a 200-acre burn project may not work on a 1,000-acre or a 2,000-acre burn project. The communication systems that we normally use can't handle that. If you're planning a project or you're on a burn day and this starts to come up, that's a definite watch out situation. And on our list is unfamiliarity with equipment, or as someone mentioned in the discussion, the failure to ensure all equipment is in working order prior to the burn. This goes back to that original, one of the first things we mentioned about use of time management. One thing that is good to use that time prior to a burn for is to make sure everything works and everybody knows how everything works prior to a burn. The time to figure out how to flow water is not when the fire is walking away from you outside your control lines. And number 11 was part of a larger discussion that we had, and I tried to summarize it in this way. Pressure to complete a project causes your mission or your operational considerations to begin to override your safety considerations. I tie this back to Standard Fire Order number 10, which is fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. Where I see this potentially being a problem is when the pressure to get a project done because you're running out of time in terms of seasonality or your burn windows or your budget begins to influence your completion of the project, or your attempts to complete the project, even though other things are telling you maybe you shouldn't do it. Even if you're if you're a burn manager or a burn boss, that's one consideration. If you're a crew member on that burn and you're starting to feel like things just aren't right and maybe you shouldn't be doing this, but you're going ahead with it anyway, that's a watch out. That's a time when you should be stepping back a bit and saying, why are we doing this? Do we really need to do this? Again, that's our list of 11 prescribed fire watchouts. Hopefully this can be used as sort of a lessons learned, or just as an addition to the 18 watchouts. Hopefully it'll provide some good information for folks going forward.